If you or someone in your family rode a bus onto a newly consolidated school for the first time, what do you remember about the ride itself? Not the new building, the ride. The 1939 National School Bus Standards Conference is where the yellow bus became a system. A future video follows that 7-day meeting in New York and the 44 rules that came out of T. Even if no one in your family ever rode a rural bus route. The pattern here is a familiar one. A system built for efficiency quietly erases a form of local knowledge that was never written down anywhere, and nobody notices until it's gone. Boone County, Indiana, October 1936, 7:04 in the morning. A driver on the county's new consolidation route, call him for this account Earl Whitfield, brought the Wayne Body bus around the bend at the Kessler Crossroads before he could see the two children who were supposed to be waiting there. He did not slow down to look for them. He knew they would be at the mailbox, because on every one of the 40-some mornings he had driven the stretch since Labor Day, they had been at the mailbox, and the 3 or 4 mornings they hadn't, it had rained the night before, which meant they were waiting instead under the lean-to at the edge of their father's barn. This was not a fact the county superintendent's office had told him. Route 4 had come with a typed sheet listing 11 stops by farm name and estimated arrival time. It had not come with a lean-to. 6 years earlier, no bus would have turned at Kessler Crossroads at all, because there had been no need for one. Field's Chapel, the one-room school a half-mile down the side road, had served the 11 families who now waved Earl Whitfield's bus past their lane. It had one teacher, 8 grades, and a walk to T that none of those children considered remarkable, because T was under a mile, and their older siblings had made the same walk. In 1934, the county board had voted to close Field's Chapel along with 3 other one-room schools in the township and route their students to the new consolidated building in town. 2 stories, a gymnasium, and 4 teachers for the 8th grade alone. The board's minutes, where they survive, describe this as an improvement in educational opportunity. They do not describe what it meant that Earl Whitfield now had to know 11 farms instead of 1. This was not untrue to Boone County. Across the rural Midwest, the Great Plains, and the South, a nationwide structural shift was underway between roughly the 1920s and the 1950s, a shift that would eventually close the overwhelming majority of America's one-room schoolhouses and replace them with fewer, larger, multi-room buildings serving a much wider radius. What made that shift administratively possible, rather than merely desirable, was not a change in educational philosophy. It was a truck with benches, and later a purpose-built body, that could cover in 20 minutes what a child's legs had covered in 25. Over a much greater distance, Earl Whitfield did not think of himself as an instrument of that shaft. He thought about the lean-to, the mailbox, and the 11 stops he had to make before the 8:15 bell. But the knowledge he was building that October, which farm ran late, which lane flooded, which child could be trusted to hear the engine before seeing the bus, was knowledge that had never existed before Route 4 existed. Because before Route 4, no single person had needed to know 11 farms at once. What was that knowledge actually replacing, and what spectacularly had the one-room school given those 11 families that the new arrangement had not yet had time to prove it could give them back? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American school bus culture from 1930 to 1980. What the bus was, how the route worked, and what the driver and the children inside it knew that no school district record ever captured. Not nostalgia for yellow buses, the documented operational and human reality of a system that carried an entire generation to school. Even if no one in your family ever rode a rural bus route, the pattern here is a familiar one. A system built for efficiency quietly erases a form of local knowledge that was never written down anywhere. And nobody notices until it's gone. And if you rode a school bus in this era, or drove one, put it in the comments. If you or someone in your family rode a bus onto a newly consolidated school for the first time, what do you remember about the RDE itself? Not the new bulldog, the RDE, The 1939 National School Bus Standards Conference is where the yellow bus became a system. A future video follows that 7-day meeting in New York and the 44 rules that came out of it. Back on Route 4, the Wayne body bus Earl Whitfield drove was not, in 1936, a factory standard product in the way a modern bus is. Wayne Works, based in Richmond, Indiana, had built its business through the 1920s and into the 1930s, producing bus bodies mounted on Ford and Chevrolet truck chassis. A body built by one company, a driver's seat built by another, joined at a bus body dealer or assembled at the district's own garage. Before that, districts across the rural Midwest and South had frequently improvised. A farm truck with benches bolted to the bed and a canvas top for weather. No windows, no heater. No standardized door. Wayne's transition to all-steel bodies with safety glass, which the company had introduced around 1930, and the heavy side guard rails that became standard through the mid-1930s, were responses to a specific documented operational problem, that a wooden or canvas body offered almost no protection in a rural county, with unimproved roads, ditches instead of shoulders, and at railroad crossings, no gate. None of this was cosmetic. The flat roof and rounded rear end that identify a Wayne body of this period existed because the company's roll-form steel panels were most efficient to produce in that shape. The guardrail running the length of the body's sides was there because collision data from rural crashes had shown that a body without one folded inward on impact in a way that a reinforced rail rested. Earl Whitfield did not need to know Wayne's engineering rationale to feel its effect. He knew that this bus took a shoulder drop into a roadside ditch differently than the county's older farm truck conversion had, and he adjusted his approach speed at 3 specific low spots on Route 4 accordingly. A piece of judgment built entirely from driving the same steel body over the same road, morning after morning, through a full county calendar of weather. What then did that vehicle, engineered for a specific set of rural hazards, actually require of the person driving it every day that no factory specification sheet had anticipated? What the vehicle demanded of Earl Whitfield was not mechanical skill in the sense of repair. The county had a mechanic for that. It demanded a form of judgment that no manual could contain, because the manual described the bus and the road separately, and the actual job was managing the two together, in a specific combination, at a specific hour, on a specific morning. Drivers who worked rural consolidation routes of this length and character in this decade describe, consistently, a working knowledge that had almost nothing to do with the route sheet studded information, farm names, approximate times, and almost everything to do with what those 11 stops behaved like under changing conditions. A low spot on Route 4 that carried standing water after 2 days of rain was passable at a certain speed, and impassable at a slightly higher one, because the higher speed sent a wave over the running boards that could stall the ignition. A driver did not learn this from a district bulletin. A driver learned it once, badly, and then adjusted permanently. The family knowledge ran alongside the road knowledge. Rural routes at this scale required a driver to synchronize, without ever discussing it directly with 11 separate households, each family's own morning rhythm, which farm's chores finished at 6:30, and which at 6:50, which household had an older sibling who walked the younger ones to the mailbox, and which did not, which family's children needed the horn, because no one inside the house was watching for the bus, and which family's children were already standing at the road before the bus came into view. None of this was recorded because none of it was, technically, the district's business. It lived entirely in the driver, and it accumulated the way any specific skill accumulates, slowly, through repetition, until a decision that had once required conscious thought became automatic. This is the piece of the consolidation story that the school board minutes do not mention, because school boards voted on buildings and budgets, not on the specific expertise a bus route quietly required of the person who drove it. The county's 1934 vote to close Fields Chapel and 3 other one-room schools was, on paper, a single administrative act. In practice, it required someone to become, over the following years, expert in a piece of geography and a set of 11 family lives that had never before needed to be held together in one person's head. Nobody hired Earl Whitfield for that expertise. Nobody measured it. And when a driver like him eventually left the route, nobody had a mechanism for handing it forward. What happened specifically to that accumulated knowledge? The standing water speed, the family rhythms, the horn or no horn judgment. When a route like this one changed hands, the knowledge that mattered on Route 4 was not confined to the driver's seat. The 11 children who rode it twice a day were building their own working model of the route, and theirs was arguably the stranger form of expertise, because none of them would have described themselves as experts in anything. They were simply riding a bus to school, but a child who rides the same 20-some minutes of road, twice a day, for a full school year, absorbs a structure that has none to do with instruction. The SPCFC Engad note as the bus climbed the grade past the county gravel pit meant roughly 10 minutes remaining. The particular way the bus rocked at the Miller Farms cattle guard meant the halfway point. The moment the brick schoolhouse tower came into view past the last stand of trees meant the ride was, for practical purposes, over, and children who had been half asleep against the window straightened up without being told to. None of this was a lesson. It was a rhythm the body learned before the mind had bothered to name it. This is where consolidation quietly did something that neither its advocates nor its critics fully accounted for. Before the buses ran, a Child's daily geography was the half ml between farmhouse and one-room school, a stand small enough that every feature of it was known personally, by name, through years of walking it along to siblings and neighbors. After consolidation, a child's daily geography became several miles of county road experience from inside a moving vehicle, landmarks recognized by sound and sequence rather than by having stood beside them. It was still a real form of local knowledge. It was spli a different K&O, bult at a different scale, through a different sense. Consider, too, what the bus put together that the one-room school never had reason to. Field's Chapel had served 11 families who already knew each other. The same neighbors, the same crossroads, the same church on Sunday. The consolidated school drew from 4 former one-room districts at once. For many of the children on Route 4, the ride itself, not the classroom, was where they first met children from 3 miles away, whose family names they had never had reason to learn. The bus, before it delivered anyone to a desk, was already doing something a one-room school building never could, putting children from separate, previously self-contained communities into the same enclosed space, twice a day, long enough for unfamiliarity to wear off. What did the small town and farm communities that had built their identity around the one-room school actually lose in that exchange? And what, if anything, replaced it? To answer that question honestly requires taking the one-room school seriously as an institution, rather than treating it as a charming relic that consolidation time proved upon. Field's Chapel, like the roughly 143,000 to 149,000 one-teacher schools that existed nationally in the early 1930s, was not merely a classroom. It was, in many rural townships, the only public building the community owned outright. The Stii of township elections, of evening literary societies, of Christmas programs that every family in the district attended regardless of whether they currently had a child enrolled. The teacher, often boarding with one of the farm families along the route, was frequently the only resident with formal education beyond grade school, and her knowledge of every child in her 8 grades, not just academically, but as individuals with their specific family circumstances, was total in a way no consolidated school's 4-teacher 8th grade staff could replicate for the same number of children. That's the case for the one-room school, and TIS a real one. The case against T, made by state educating offcales and reform-minded administrators throughout the 1920s and 1930s, was also real. A single teacher covering 8 grades could not offer laboratory sense, could not offer a foreign language, could not offer the kind of specialized instruction that a graduating 8th grader would need if college rather than the family farm, was where they were headed. State Board of Education requirements in several Midwestern states during this period increasingly specified minimum enrollment thresholds and curriculum enrollment thresholds and curriculum offerings that a school the SC of Feld's Chapel Assembly could not meet, which meant that by the MD 1930s, closure was frequently not really a local decision at all. It was a certification requirement the county could not satisfy any other way. Both of these things were true at once, and the consolidation movement's tragedy, if it had one, was not that it made the wrong choice. It was that the debate was conducted almost entirely in terms of buildings, budgets, and curricula. The countable things, while the thing that could not be counted, the specific social function the one-room school performed as the community's shared civic space, was rarely put on the ledger at all. It disappeared from the township's daily life at the same moment it disappeared from the school board's balance sheet, and nobody had assigned it a value in either place. What did the county do, specifically, with a building like Field's Chapel once its educational function ended? And did the loss of the schoolhouse as a gathering place get replaced by anything? Or did the township simply do without? The answer to the township's loss is complicated by the fact that consolidated CRTCs, throughout the era, were not simply nostalgics for the old schoolhouse. They punted at SPCFC documented operational failures that the new system had not solved, and in some counties, had made worse. The most persistent of these was road quality. A one-room school recorded nothing of the county's roads, because Cauldron walked to tea on paths and lanes that needed no engineering beyond passability on foot. A consolidated school, reachable only by bus, made the county's unpaved and gravel road network suddenly load-bearing in a way it had never been designed for. Rural road improvements through the 1930s and into the 1950s, funded in part by New Deal infrastructure programs, did gradually make consolidated routing more reliable. But the gap between that improvement and the pace of school closures was, in many countries, wide enough that for a full decade or more, buses like Earl Whitfield's were running longer routes over roads no better suited to bus traffic than they had been before. The second percent CRTCSM was distanced self, where a one-room school had asked a call D for a walk of 1 to 3 miles at most. A consolidated route frequently asked for a ride of 10, 15, sometimes over 20 miles each way. A genuine daily burden, however comfortable the ride, that fell hardest on the youngest children and on families, whose farms sat farthest from the county's main roads. Longer rides meant earlier mornings, and earlier mornings meant a 6-year-old on Route 4 was sometimes watching at a mailbox in the dark, in a way no 7-year-old walking a half-mile to Feld's Chapel in Daylight had ever needed to. The third was the loss of hyper-local control, a CRTCSM that was as much political as practical. A one-room school's trustees were 3 neighbors elected by the same 11 families, whose cauldron attended tea. A consolidated DSTRCT school board answered to a far larger and more diffuse electorate, and a family whose one-room school had just been closed by county vote frequently found that individual concerns now carried a fraction of the weight they once had. Historians who have studied the consolidation movement's long-run effects on earnings and educational attainment have generally found real benefits for the students who went through the larger schools. But the political cost, measured in local trust rather than test scores, was rarely counted in the same studies, and it is not a cost that disappears just because it resists measurement. Given all 3 of these persistent documented criticisms, why did the consolidation movement not simply stall out under the weight of them? What allowed it to proceed anyway, decade after decade, until the numbers involved became almost total? What allowed consolidation to proceed past its critics was, more than anything else, the Great Depression, an economic force that made the one-room school's continuation not merely ineffective, but frequently unaffordable. Rural property values, which funded local school taxes almost entirely in Theo's era, collapsed through the early 1930s, and districts that had scraped by on a single teacher's modest salary and a stove's worth of coal now found that they could not scrape by at all. More than 20,000 rural schools were affected by closures not only between 1930 and 1934 alone, And while some of those closures were temporary emergency measures rather than permanent consolidation, the crisis reset the baseline. Counties that had resisted consolidation on principle now faced it as a matter of survival. The numbers that followed are worth stating plainly, because they are the clearest evidence of how total this shift became. In 1930, the country had roughly 128,000 to 130,000 school districts. By 1940, the number of one-room schools alone had fallen from around 149,000 to about 114,000, a decline of nearly a quarter in a single decade, before the post-war consolidation wave had even begun. By 1970, the total number of school districts nationally had fallen to somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000, a reduction from the 1930 figure of roughly 9 out of every 10 districts in the country. Between 1945 and 1965 alone, at least 45 states passed legislation explicitly encouraging or requiring further consolidation, turning what had begun as a Depression-era necessity into a permanent bipartisan policy commitment that outlasted the crisis that started it by decades. By 2020, fewer than 13,000 districts remained nationally, a structural transformation spanning 90 years. The public school governance in the United States has never reversed. None of this happened because the one-room schools' defenders were wrong about what they were losing. It happened because the reformers' argument, better facultés, broader curricula, spec-als teachers, economies of scale, proved persuasive to state legislatures and eventually to many of the same rural families whose grandparents had fought consolidation votes a generation earlier. Younger parents in the 1940s and 1950s, wanting for their own children the science labs and foreign language instruction the one-room school could never offer, frequently supported the very changes their own parents had wrested. The generational argument NSD individual rural communities was, and so T's own way, as significant as the argument at the state legislature, and running underneath every one of these numbers, on every one of these newly extended routes, was Stala Driver like Earl Whitfield, and a busload of cauldron like the 11 on Route 4. Absorbing, one morning at a TM, the SPCFC knowledge that a structural transformaton this large never had a mechanism to record. What happened to that knowledge as the routes kept getting longer, and the consolidations kept coming, through the 1940s and into the 1950s? As consolidations accumulated through the late 1930s and into the post-war decades, the individual route did not simply get longer. It got standardized in a way that changed what the driver's knowledge was even for. In April 1939, Frank W. Sear, a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, convened a 7-day conference in New York, funded by a $5,000 Rockefeller Foundation grant that brought together transportation officials from all 48 states along with school bus manufacturers. The conference produced 44 national construction standards, covering body length, ceiling height, aisle width, and the detail that outlasted every other, a specific shade of yellow, formally designated National School Bus Chrome, selected because black lettering against that color remained legible in the low light of early morning and late afternoon. Before 1939, a Wayne body in one state and a Wayne body in another might have differed meaningfully in dimension and construction. After 1939, for the first time, a bus built to specification in Indiana and a bus built to specification in Georgia were, within a real margin, the same vehicle. This standardization served consolidation directly. A national specification meant a state Department of Education could write transportation funding formulas around a known vehicle, meant manufacturers could produce at a scale that brought unit costs down, and meant a distinct merging 4 one-room schools into one building, could purchase buses with confidence that they met a uniform safety floor, rather than whatever a local body and chassis assembly happened to produce. The system that Earl Whitfield had learned by trial in 1936, how the SPCFC composed body behaved no roads to dodge, was, within a few years, being engineered out from under hum by Deskin standards that assumed a driver would encounter a more predictable, more uniform vehicle. What standardization did not and structurally could not Touch was the route knowledge itself, because a route sheet, however carefully typed, describes farms and mileage, not the specific behavior of 11 households on a specific morning. Even as the vehicle became more uniform across the country, the knowledge required to drive any one specific stretch of any one specific county road remained entirely local, entirely undocumented, and entirely dependent on one person, continuing to drive it. The 1939 conference had solved the vehicle. It had not solved, and had never attempted to solve, the driver. As routes lengthened through the 1940s to absorb more and more of the closing one-room schools, what happened to the drivers who had built 14, or even just 4, years of exactly this kind of knowledge on a route that the county then decided to extend, reroute, or merge with another? Doctors who worked rural consolidation routes across this era describe, consistently, the same basic pattern when a route changed hands, whether through retirement, reassignment, or the merger of 2 routes into one longer route, as yet another one-room school closed nearby. The new driver received the same type sheet the old driver had once received: farm names, approximate times, mileage. What the new driver did not receive, because there was no format in which to give it, was the standing water speed at the specific low spot, the Spetsy household that needed the horn, the Spetsy creek crossing that behaved differently after a hard freeze than after an ordinary ran. That knowledge had never been written down because nobody had ever asked the driver to write it down. It existed only as long as the person who held it kept driving. This is not a sentimental claim about lost innocence. It is a specific, structural feature of how rural school transportation actually operated for decades. An entire category of operationally relevant knowledge, safety relevant in some cases, that lived exclusively in individual, uncertified, unrecorded expertise, and that a growing standardizing school transportation system relied on, without ever building a mechanism to preserve it. Every time a route consolidated with another, or a long-tenured driver moved on, some portion of that expertise simply ended. The new driver learned the route again, the way the old driver once had, through a season of trial, sometimes through a Spec FC mistake at a Spec FC low spot and a Spec FC ran. The same pattern held for the children, on a different time scale. A child who had spent 9 years absorbing the specific rhythm of Route 4, the grade past the gravel PT, the cattle guard, the tower past the trees, carried that geography with them for exactly as long as they rode the bus, and not oppressively longer. When they graduated, or when the family moved, or when the route itself was restructured to serve a newer, larger consolidated district built to absorb yet more of the shrunken pool of one-room schools, that Spec FC bodily knowledge of that Spec FC road had nowhere further to go. It was not false to say that Generaton had learned their county the way no later Generaton, delivered by increasingly standards and increasingly anonymous routes, would again, but T.S. equally true that this same generation had gained things Fields Chapel could never have given them, and both of those statements can be documented as fact without either one canceling the other out. By the 1950s, with routes across the rural Midwest routinely covering distances that would have been unthinkable for a one-room school-era child on foot, what did the completed transformation actually look like from inside a single remaining route? And what, specifically, marked its final stage? By the early 1950s, Boone County's remaining rural districts had been folded almost entirely into a small handful of consolidated systems. Fields Chapel's closure in 1934 had been an early instance of a pattern that, by this point, had become the norm rather than the exception across the rural Midwest, the Great Plains, and the South. Fewer, larger buildings, longer, standardized routes, a school bus fleet built to national specification rather than local improvisation. The specific mechanism that had made this possible, the truck with benches, and later the purpose-built steel body, capable of covering in 20 minutes what a child's legs required 25 to cover over a much greater distance, had by 1950 become so thoroughly unremarkable that a family boarding their child onto a bus for the first time no longer experienced it as a change at all. It was simply how school worked. That is itself the measure of how complete the structural shift had been. What started as roughly 128,000 school districts and something close to 149,000 one-room schools in the early 1930s had been reduced, within a single working lifetime, to a fraction so small that by 1979, out of every 10 of those districts were simply gone, and by 2020 fewer than 13,000 remained nationally. The school bus did not cause that number by itself, but without it, the number is not conceivable at all. No one-room school closes in a county where a 10 or 20-mile radius of farm children has no way to reach whatever replaces it. What the consolidated system gave, a gymnasium, a science laboratory, a foreign language class, 4 teachers instead of 1 for the same 8th grade, and for the students who went through it, measurably better long-run outcomes in earnings and educational attainment than researchers have found for comparable students in the districts that resisted consolidation longest. What it did not give back, the half-mile walk that had let a child know every neighbor along it personally, the one-room school as a township's only shared civic building, the specific expertise that a driver like Earl Whitfield had built, one low spot and one household at a time, over years that no personnel file described, the specific rhythm, the grade past the gravel pit, the cattle guard, the tower past the trees, that had lived entirely in the bodies of children who rode a route long enough for it to matter, and that ended the moment they no longer rode it. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these routes and in the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There are more buses, more routes, more drivers, and more children's geographies that were built by daily repetition and never written down. Even if no one in your family ever rode a rural bus route, the pattern here is a familiar one. A system built for efficiency quietly erases a form of local knowledge that was never written down anywhere, and nobody notices until it's gone. And if you have a memory of a bus, a driver, a route, a bump in the road that told you where you were, put it in the comments. If you or someone in your family rode a bus onto a newly consolidated school for the first time, what do you remember about the ride itself? The 1939 National School Bus Standards Conference is where the yellow bus became a system. A future video follows that 7-day meeting and the 44 rules that came out of it. A driver on a route like Route 4 heard the crossroads before he saw it. He had learned to hear it before he knew he was learning anything. The dip past the gravel pit told him 10 minutes. The cattle guard told him the halfway point. He did not think about this. He simply knew it, and he knew it because the route had taught him. Twice a day, for as many years as he drove it, without ever meaning to, and without anyone ever writing it down.